In the icy heart of the Karakoram Range, a lone mountaineer named Avery Landon was about to confront more than altitude and cold. What began as a solitary climb turned deadly when a Black Ops team descended on the peak with orders to contain an ancient anomaly buried beneath the summit. Avery Landon wasn't your typical high-altitude climber. For 15 years, she had been one of the world's most elite expedition leaders, a former Alpine Rescue specialist and survivor of the Annapurna disaster, known for predicting avalanches minutes before they struck and for saving 6 lives with a single call. When the covert team deployed containment charges near the summit crater, they had no idea they were provoking a presence that remembered everything. Avery countered not with force, but with connection, following the guidance of a silent, amber-eyed stray who had saved her life more than once. What began as an ascent into grief would become a communion with something not of this earth. The Karakoram would never be the same after Avery stepped beyond the summit and vanished into a mountain that watches, remembers, and chooses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Air this thin made silence tangible. Avery Landon felt it press against her eardrums as she placed each careful step onto the pristine snow, her crampons biting into the hard-packed surface with satisfying crunches that died seconds after birth. 6 days since she'd spoken aloud to another human being. 12 since she'd left the last outpost of civilization in the Pakistani village of Ascole, where weathered locals had watched her with knowing eyes as she purchased final supplies. The mountain you seek has no name, the old shopkeeper had told her in halting English, refusing to meet her gaze. Some things are better left unnamed. Avery had nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Names had never mattered much to her. Only elevation, pitch, oxygen levels, and survival rates. And this peak, this nameless, seldom climbed giant in the heart of the Karakoram Range, had claimed enough lives to earn its fearsome reputation without requiring a label. The late afternoon sun cast her shadow long across the snowfield as she traversed the glacier toward the site she'd marked for her first high camp. 3,000 meters up, another 1,900 to the summit. The icy ridgeline cut against the cobalt sky like a serrated knife, taunting her with its distant promise. Avery adjusted her pack, feeling the familiar, comforting strain across her shoulders, a physical weight to balance the invisible one she'd carried for 3 years. Focus on the climb. One step, then another. Her inner voice had the same measured cadence she'd once used with clients and teammates. Before the Annapurna disaster. Before she'd watched 2 of her closest friends vanish beneath tons of shifting ice and snow, their emergency beacons pinging with decreasing urgency until they finally, mercifully, went silent. Avery blinked hard, dispelling the memory. The investigation had cleared her of negligence. Weather patterns had shifted unexpectedly. The avalanche risk had escalated from moderate to severe in minutes. No one could have predicted it. No one, except perhaps someone who'd spent 15 years reading mountains, who had sensed something wrong in the air that morning, but had pushed on anyway because the clients were eager and the window of opportunity was narrowing. This climb was different. Solo. No one to protect but herself. No one to fail. She reached the outcropping she'd identified from satellite imagery, a natural windbreak with a relatively flat area for her tent. Perfect. Methodically, she unpacked, driving anchors into the ice with practiced precision. The small orange dome of her tent bloomed against the white landscape like a defiant flower. Avery crawled inside, her body grateful for the respite from the cutting wind. The GPS transmitter came to life with a green glow as she pressed the check-in button. 3 seconds, then confirmation. Position received. Maya would know she was still alive, still climbing. Her sister hadn't approved of this expedition, had called it a frozen suicide note. But Maya didn't understand. Couldn't understand. The mountains weren't a death wish. They were the only place where Avery could still breathe. She unfolded her map, tracing tomorrow's route with a gloved finger. The unmarked peak stared back at her from the topographical lines, somehow more ominous in its namelessness. The few climbers who'd attempted it spoke of strange magnetic disturbances, of compasses spinning uselessly, of hallucinations and disorientation near the summit. Most had turned back. Those who hadn't, Avery pushed away the thought. Superstition had no place in her pack. Outside, the light was fading fast, the temperature plummeting. She fired up her small stove, melting snow for drinking water and her dehydrated meal. As the water heated, something caught her eye near the tent entrance, indentations in the snow. She leaned closer, frowning. Tracks, animal tracks partially filled with fresh powder, too large for a snow leopard, too defined for wind erosion. Dog-like, but impossibly high in the range. And strangely, they seemed to lead toward the pass, not away from it, toward the summit she sought. Just a coincidence, she told herself, though the hair on her neck prickled. Nothing survived up here for long, nothing except ice and rock and the occasional foolish human. After eating, she made her final notes of the day in her expedition log. The satellite phone came next, a quick message to her emergency contact. But when she powered it on, the screen flickered erratically, static hissing from the speaker. Avery frowned, tapping the device against her palm. Nothing. Only bursts of white noise and strange electronic whines that sounded almost like distant voices. Battery error? Signal interference? She tried the GPS again. Still functioning, though the coordinates seemed to jump slightly before stabilizing. Avery sighed, tucking both devices into her insulated gear bag. She'd try again in the morning. Technology was always temperamental at altitude. That night, sleep came in fitful waves. The wind rose, moaning around her tent like something in pain. Each time she drifted off, her dreams slid into the same unsettling sequence. Snow falling upward from the ground to the sky, swirling in impossible patterns. Climbers she'd known, some living, some dead, walking alongside her toward the peak, their faces turned away, and beneath it all a soft rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat coming from deep within the mountain itself. She jerked awake just before dawn, her breath clouding in the frigid air of the tent. The dream clung to her like frost, refusing to melt away with consciousness. Outside, the wind had stopped completely. The silence was absolute, unnatural. Avery shivered despite her down sleeping bag. "You're being ridiculous," she chided herself. "Altitude playing tricks, nothing more." Yet as she emerged from the tent into the pale morning light, the stillness felt almost sentient, like the mountain was holding its breath, watching her, waiting. She forced herself to go through her morning routine. Melt water, eat, pack camp, check gear. The GPS registered her position correctly now, but the satellite phone remained obstinately silent. She shouldered her pack, plotting her course up the next section, a relatively straightforward ascent toward the glacial pass that would lead to the mountain's eastern face. The sky above was perfectly clear, a deep, impossible blue. No sign of the weather system that had been forecasted. Another anomaly. That's when she saw it, a flicker of movement against the expanse of white, perhaps 300 meters away. Avery squinted, reaching for her binoculars. Through the lenses, the shape solidified briefly. 4 legs, tail, pointed ears. A dog, or something like it, watching her from atop a snow-covered boulder. Impossible. A hallucination, surely. The altitude, the isolation, her mind creating companions where none existed. She lowered the binoculars, blinking hard. When she looked again, the figure was gone. Lack of oxygen. Brain inventing patterns. She repeated the rational explanation to herself as she began her upward trek. Yet she couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, followed. Twice more she thought she caught glimpses of something moving parallel to her path, always just at the edge of her peripheral vision. By nightfall, she'd reached her second planned camp. The routine was the same. Tent, water, food, log. No sign of the phantom dog, though the strange animal tracks appeared again, fresher this time, circling the site she'd chosen before continuing upward. The unsettled feeling grew, lodging beneath her ribs like an icicle. Sleep came more easily, from sheer exhaustion, but the dreams returned, more vivid now. Snow falling upward. the heartbeat of the mountain growing louder. And this time a new element. Eyes watching her from the darkness, neither human nor animal, patient and ancient. Morning broke with startling clarity. Avery unzipped her tent, squinting against the brilliant reflection of sunlight on snow. And there, sitting calmly 10 meters away, was the dog, painfully thin, fur matted and frosted, one ear torn, eyes the color of old amber fixed directly on hers. Not a hallucination, not this time. Avery stared at the dog, frozen in disbelief. Their gazes locked across the snow, hers wide with shock, the animal's steady and somehow knowing. Neither moved for several breaths. "Go on," she finally said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Get out of here." The dog didn't flinch. It simply sat, its breath creating small clouds in the frigid air, impossibly calm at this altitude where oxygen was precious and survival tenuous at best. "You can't be here," Avery muttered, more to herself than the animal. "Nothing survives, up here, not without gear and planning." Yet the evidence sat before her, contradicting everything she knew about the limits of endurance. The dog was emaciated but alert, its coat patchy with old scars visible beneath the matted fur. One ear was torn, and it held one paw slightly raised, suggesting past injury. But its eyes, amber, intelligent, and utterly focused, belied its broken appearance. Avery snapped into action, packing her camp with practiced efficiency. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't her concern. She had a summit to reach, ghosts of her own to outrun. The animal would either leave or die. Nature had never been sentimental about survival. She set off toward the steep incline leading to the pass, poles biting into the snow with rhythmic precision. After 20 minutes, she glanced back. The dog followed at a steady distance, its gait slightly uneven but determined. "I'm not feeding you," she called back. "I barely have enough for myself." The dog maintained its pace, neither closing the gap nor falling behind. Fine. Let it follow until it gave up. Avery had spent enough time in the Himalayas and Karakoram to know that feral dogs sometimes trailed along the lower base camps, scavenging for scraps. But none ventured this high. None survived the cold, the thin air, the lack of food. It would turn back eventually. By midday, the sun beat down with deceiving warmth while the air remained bitterly cold. Avery paused to adjust her route, consulting her map. The dog stopped too, watching her from 20 meters back. It hadn't made a sound. No barking, no whining, not even the panting typical of canines at exertion. "Silent type, huh?" she said, surprised at her urge to speak to it. "Me too." The dog tilted its head, almost as if considering her words. Avery turned away, unnerved. She was anthropomorphizing, assigning human traits to an animal, a dangerous habit in the wilderness. Sentimentality killed climbers, so did distraction. She moved on to what appeared to be a snow bridge spanning a narrow section between two ridges. The snow packed firm beneath her crampons, stable enough. She was halfway across when she heard it, the first sound from the dog, a low, urgent growl. Avery glanced back. The animal stood rigid, hackles raised, staring directly at the snow. Several meters ahead of her, she froze, instinct overriding skepticism. Slowly, she extended her ice axe, probing the area the dog watched so intently. The tip of the axe punched through an invisible weak spot. A spiderweb of cracks shot outward from the point of impact, and a section of snow collapsed inward, revealing a yawning crevasse beneath, at least 30 meters deep, with jagged ice, walls leading to darkness below. Had she taken 2 more steps? Her heart hammered as she carefully backed away, returning to solid ground. The dog had already retreated to safer terrain, watching her with those unnerving amber eyes. "How did you know?" she whispered. A coincidence. It had to be. Yet doubt crept in, cold as the wind that suddenly gusted across the exposed ridge. That night, Avery made camp in the shelter of an ice wall. The dog kept its distance, settling on a rock outcropping with sightlines to both Avery and the path ahead. It curled into a tight ball but didn't close its eyes, vigilant even, as darkness fell. Avery found herself setting aside a portion of her rehydrated stew, a third of her dinner, more than she could spare. She placed the titanium cup at the edge of her camp before retreating into her tent. Just this once, she told herself. Thank you for the crevasse, that's all. From her tent, she watched through the small opening. The dog approached cautiously, consumed the offering in seconds, then returned to its perch. It didn't beg for more. In her expedition log, she made a clinical note about the incident at the snow bridge. Her pen hovered over the page before, adding, "Dog continues to follow. Shows unusual awareness of terrain dangers. Possibly trained for search and rescue and subsequently abandoned, lost. Responds to no commands. Makes minimal sound. Will observe further." She hesitated, then wrote, "Calling it Ghost for now. Fitting for both its appearance and silence." Sleep came fitfully. Outside, the wind rose to a moaning howl, driving snow against the tent walls. Avery woke at dawn to find visibility reduced to mere meters. The world beyond a swirling white void, a whiteout. Dangerous, potentially fatal if she lost orientation. She would have to wait it out, burning precious time and supplies. Ghost was nowhere in sight. Likely sought better shelter or finally surrendered to the elements. Yet Avery felt a surprising pang of disappointment. She busied herself with melting snow, checking her oxygen levels, recalculating her timeline. The satellite phone remained useless, emitting only static and that strange, almost voice beneath the electronic noise. Even the GPS readings fluctuated, wildly now, showing her position jumping kilometers in impossible directions. A shadow moved through the curtain of white. Ghost materialized at the edge of her visibility, snow crusted on his fur, standing rigid, staring not at her but up the slope with intense focus. Then he barked, a sharp commanding sound that startled her with its suddenness after so much silence. He looked at her, barked again, then trotted several meters up slope before stopping to look back. "You want me to follow? In this?" Avery gestured at the whiteout. "That's suicide." Ghost barked a third time, more insistent. Against every protocol and rational thought, Avery found herself packing up, securing her most vital gear. She followed the dog into the blinding white, trusting her compass even as its needle swung erratically. Ghost remained just visible ahead, a darker smudge against endless white, stopping periodically to ensure she followed. They had traveled perhaps 200 meters when Ghost suddenly veered sharply right, leading her behind a massive boulder formation she would never have seen. In the whiteout, they had just rounded it when she heard it, a deep, resonant crack that vibrated through her boots. The avalanche roared down the exact path they had been on moments before. The ground shook as tons of snow and ice thundered past their shelter, close enough that Avery felt the displaced air rush past her face. Had she remained at her camp or continued on the original path? She slid down against the rock, legs suddenly weak. Ghost sat nearby, watching the white torrent with detached calm, as if he'd expected nothing less. "What are you?" Avery whispered. No coincidence this time. No rational explanation for how a stray dog could anticipate an avalanche, much less lead her to safety through zero visibility. Her scientific mind struggled for answers, finding none that fit within her understanding of the natural world. The storm cleared by late afternoon, revealing a transformed landscape. Where there had been a path now lay a chaotic jumble of snow and debris. Avery plotted a new route, acutely aware of Ghost watching her process. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of being responsible for another life, and the strange comfort of not being entirely alone. That night, she left the tent flap partially open, an invitation Ghost didn't accept. Yet he slept closer than before, just beyond the entrance, his body curved toward her like a guardian. In the morning, Ghost was already up, pacing in tight circles near a section of the slope that appeared no different from any other. Avery approached cautiously. The dog began pawing at the snow with unmistakable purpose. "What is it, Ghost? What did you find?" She knelt beside him, brushing away the snow he'd disturbed. Her glove scraped against something solid, metallic, not rock. Avery dug more quickly, uncovering a curved edge. Rivets, faded paint. The unmistakable shape of an airplane wing emerged from its icy tomb. Avery's gloved fingers brushed snow and ice from the wing, revealing faded insignia, the unmistakable star and bars of the U.S. military. Her pulse quickened. Nothing was supposed to be here. No recorded crashes, no known expeditions. The Karakoram's more remote peaks remained largely untouched by human history, or so she had believed. "What the hell is this doing here?" she whispered. Ghost paced, anxiously several meters away, refusing to approach the wreckage, fur bristling along his spine. His earlier determination had evaporated, replaced by visible distress. Avery followed the line of the buried wing, digging with renewed urgency. The snow gave way to reveal more of the aircraft. A mid-sized transport plane, twisted and partially sheared by impact. The glacier had preserved it with eerie perfection, the metal cold but largely intact beneath its icy shroud. Decades old, judging by the design. World War II era, perhaps. At the exposed edge of the fuselage, she found a small section of the identification markings still legible. KM 5749, U.S. Army Air Forces, 1944. 80 years, she breathed, her words forming clouds in the frigid air. "You've been here for 80 years. Ghost suddenly barked, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed across the snowfield. He stared at the wreckage, then back at her, his amber eyes wide and unblinking. "It's okay," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring the dog or herself. "I just need to look." She used her ice axe to widen a jagged tear in the fuselage, creating an opening large enough to crawl through. Ghost's barking intensified, his voice bouncing off the surrounding ice faces with haunting clarity. "Stay there then," she told him, pulling out her headlamp. "I won't be long." Inside, the wreckage was a frozen time capsule. Shattered instruments, torn metal, and scattered equipment created a chaotic tableau, all preserved beneath a thin veneer of ice. Avery moved carefully, aware of the aircraft's precarious position within the glacier. Her light caught something pale among the debris. Bones. Human bones, partially obscured by tattered remains of a flight jacket, a pilot, still strapped into what remained of his seat. The cold had mummified portions of tissue, creating a grotesque hybrid of skeleton and preserved flesh. Avery swallowed hard, forcing back the instinctive revulsion. She was no stranger to death in the mountains, had seen climbers broken on the rocks, preserved by cold until they resembled wax figures more than humans. Yet this was different. This was history, mystery, a puzzle frozen in time. Near the pilot's remains, a leather satchel lay wedged beneath a collapsed instrument panel. Avery worked it free, surprised by its intact condition. Military-grade, waterproof leather, designed to withstand extreme conditions. She unclasped it with trembling fingers. Inside, she found a logbook, maps, and what appeared to be a personal journal, its pages stiff but legible. The name inside the cover, Captain Solomon Price, USAF. "Hello, Captain," she whispered. "What were you doing up here?" Outside, Ghost's barking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. Avery secured the satchel and made her way back through the fuselage opening. Ghost stood rigid, staring at what seemed to be empty air above the wreckage. His gaze tracked something invisible, head turning slowly as if following movement. "Ghost? What is it?" The dog glanced at her briefly, then returned to watching the empty space, a low growl building in his throat. Avery looked up, seeing nothing but clear blue sky. No birds, no clouds, nothing that could explain the dog's behavior. An uneasy feeling settled between her shoulder blades, a primal instinct that recognized danger before the conscious mind could identify it. "Let's get some distance," she decided aloud. They made camp a quarter-mile from the wreckage site, behind a natural ice formation that provided shelter from the wind. Only when the tent was secured and her stove humming with blue flame did Avery allow herself to examine the contents of the satchel more thoroughly. The maps first. Topographical surveys of the region, hand-annotated with coordinates and cryptic notations. One location was circled repeatedly with red pencil, the very peak she was climbing. Next to it, someone had written, "Signal source? Magnetic anomaly confirmed." The logbook contained flight plans, fuel calculations, and mission, parameters so heavily redacted that only fragments remained visible. Operation Cold Witness. Investigate reports of unusual, civilian witnesses describe lights and classified priority ultra. Avoid Soviet detection at all costs. Avery turned to the journal, a compact book bound in worn leather. The writing inside was more personal, immediate. She flipped past early entries describing transport flights and military routine, stopping when the handwriting changed, becoming more urgent. October 17th, 1944. 3 days circling these godforsaken peaks. Compass malfunctions increasing in frequency. Radio picks up strange transmissions. Voices speaking no language I recognize. Henson thinks it's Soviet counterintelligence. I'm not convinced. October 19th, pinpointed the signal source to an uncharted peak. Magnetic readings off the charts. Command wants samples, photographs. Weather deteriorating. Wilson spotted lights on the summit. Says they moved like they were thinking. Nonsense, but the men are uneasy. Avery paused, the parallels to her own experience sending a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Her equipment malfunctions, the static voices on her satellite phone, echoes of what Price had experienced 8 decades earlier. She read on. Ghost now, lying tensely at the tent entrance, his eyes never leaving the direction of the wreckage. October 21st. Attempted landing at 4,500 meters on a plateau. Downdrafts nearly killed us. Instruments failed completely during approach. Something is alive beneath the ice. I felt it. A pulse, a rhythm. The men think I'm cracking. Maybe I am. October. 2. The cold is different here. Patches of warmth where there should be none. Time feels wrong. Peters checked his watch against mine. His ran 4 hours ahead over the course of an afternoon. Impossible. Command radio silent after we reported the anomaly. On our own now. October the 23rd or 24th. No longer certain. Circling for landing. Attempt tomorrow. Sometimes I see people on the ridge who vanish when I look directly. The snow falls upward near the peak. Upward, against gravity. God help us. Avery's breath caught. Snow falling upward. Her dreams. Her exact dreams. The final entry was dated simply, last day. The handwriting jagged and rushed. Crash imminent. Controls no longer respond. Magnetic field too strong. If found, stay away from the peak. There is a path marked by 3 stone teeth on the eastern ridge. It leads to what I can only describe as a wound in the summit, a place where the rules we know no longer apply. I've seen what waits there in my dreams, not hostile, not benevolent, ancient. Beyond our understanding, some warnings are meant to be heeded, some discoveries must remain. The entry ended abruptly, the pen trailing off the page. Avery stared at the unfinished thought, a cold weight settling in her stomach. The rational part of her mind scrambled for explanations. Altitude hallucinations, perhaps, or mass hysteria among a frightened flight crew. But the precision of the details, the eerie alignment with her own experiences. She opened her expedition log and began making meticulous notes, recording every unexplainable event since beginning her climb. The strange animal tracks, the electronic interference, her recurring dreams, Ghost's impossible knowledge of danger. The evidence mounted, a challenge to everything she understood about reality. That night, sleep eluded her. The wind outside seemed to carry whispers, fragments of voices just below the threshold of comprehension. Beside the tent, Ghost remained vigilant, occasionally growling at shadows Avery couldn't see. Just before dawn, she stepped outside to check their surroundings. The stars blazed with cold fire above. the Milky Way a river of light across the black void. Ghost stood suddenly, staring intently upslope. Following his gaze, Avery saw them for the first time. 3 distinctive rock formations jutting from the ridgeline, their jagged silhouettes resembling fangs against the star-filled sky. 3 stone teeth, exactly as Price had described. Ghost looked at her, then back at the stones. Without warning, he bolted, racing up the slope with unexpected speed, his form quickly swallowed by pre-dawn shadows. "Ghost!" Avery called, voice echoing uselessly across the empty snowfield. "Ghost, come back!" But the dog was gone, vanished toward the wound in the summit that had claimed Solomon Price and his crew 80 years before. "Ghost!" Avery called, again her voice swallowed by the vastness of the mountain. No response. She cursed under her breath, hastily gathering essential gear. Following the dog was irrational, dangerous, violating every solo climbing protocol she'd established over 15 years. Yet the alternative, continuing alone, without the inexplicable guidance that had twice saved her life, felt even more perilous. Dawn broke as she set out, bathing the eastern face in pale gold light. The 3 stone teeth loomed ahead, their jagged profiles more menacing in daylight. They formed a natural gateway to the upper section of the mountain, a passageway that didn't appear on any of her maps or satellite imagery. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Avery checked her compass out of habit. The needle spun lazily, settling in a different direction each time. Her GPS screen displayed impossible coordinates, placing her simultaneously in Pakistan, Tibet, and oddly Antarctica. She switched it off, conserving battery. Now she was truly navigating blind, relying only on her senses and the vanished dog's lead. As she approached the stone teeth, the air changed. Not thinner, as expected with increasing altitude, but different, heavier. Charged like the atmosphere before a storm. Her ears popped painfully. Each breath felt unnaturally warm in her lungs despite the sub-zero temperature. Between the rock formations, boot prints and paw prints led upward through virgin snow. Something caught her attention. The snow surrounding. The tracks appeared suspended. Tiny ice crystals hung motionless in the air, defying gravity, glittering in the morning light like diamond dust frozen in time. "What the hell?" Avery whispered, passing her gloved hand through the suspended particles. They parted around her fingers, then resumed their stationary position, neither falling nor drifting. Beyond the stone teeth, the trail led to a wide, shallow depression in the mountain's shoulder, a perfect circle perhaps 30 meters across. The perimeter was rimmed with smooth, dark ice unlike anything Avery had ever seen on a mountain. Not the milky blue-white of a glacier or the crystalline transparency of fresh ice, but something obsidian, almost metallic in appearance. Ghost stood at the edge of this crater, his posture rigid with tension. As Avery approached, he circled, nervously pawing at the strange black ice before retreating, only to approach again like he was fighting contradictory instincts. "What did you find, boy?" Avery asked softly. Kneeling at the crater's edge, she immediately felt it, warmth radiating from below, a physical impossibility at this altitude. The black ice felt smooth beneath her gloved hand, unnaturally so, as if polished by something other than wind and time. She brushed away a thin layer of loose snow, revealing more of the surface. It was translucent, allowing faint visibility into the depths beneath. Something moved there, a rhythmic pulsation of light, organic in its irregularity. Red-gold, then blue-white, then darkness, repeating in slow waves that seemed to match the cadence of a resting heartbeat. Avery recoiled instinctively, then forced herself to look again. The logical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive on mountains that killed the unprepared and unlucky, struggled to categorize what she was seeing. Geothermal activity? Some form of bioluminescent algae beneath the ice? Neither explanation satisfied. She removed her glove, hesitating only briefly before placing her bare palm against the black ice. Heat surged up her arm, not burning but intense, alive. With the contact came images, violent, chaotic flashes not her own. Aircraft spiraling, Down instrumentation wild. Captain Price fighting the controls as the sky and mountain traded places. Men screaming as something pulls at their minds, reshaping thought into new geometries. The black ice cracking upon impact, the pulse beneath quickening as if in recognition. Price dragging himself through snow, fingers bleeding, eyes wild with revelation, whispering, "It remembers. God help us, it remembers all of us." Avery broke contact with a gasp, falling backward onto the snow. The memories, Price's memories, lingered like after-images burned into her vision. Not imagined, not hallucinated, but transferred, gifted. A direct communication across 8 decades of time. She retched into the snow, overwhelmed by the vertigo of experiencing another's death. Ghost whined, approaching to nudge her shoulder with his muzzle, the first time he'd initiated contact. "It's alive," she whispered, meeting the dog's amber. "Ice, the mountain, the ice, it's alive somehow and it remembers." As if responding to her realization, a sudden gust of wind swept across the crater. The suspended ice crystals swirled upward, no longer random but organizing into distinct patterns. First geometric shapes, then more complex forms that reminded Avery of neural pathways, root systems, river deltas, organic architecture repeating at different scales. For a fleeting moment, the pattern seemed to form a face, neither human nor animal, but something that suggested consciousness, awareness. Then it dissolved, the crystals dispersing and resuming their frozen suspension. Avery sat motionless, heart pounding. For the first time in her climbing career, she considered turning back. Whatever waited at the summit exceeded the boundaries of known science, known reality. Perhaps the locals were right to leave it unnamed, unknown. But even as the thought formed, she recognized its futility. She hadn't chosen this mountain by accident. Throughout her preparation, she'd felt drawn to it, compelled by something beyond rational interest. The coordinates had appeared in her dreams before she ever saw them on a map. The route had felt familiar from the first step, though she'd never set foot on this peak before. "It called me here," she said aloud, the realization both terrifying and strangely calming. "Just like it called to Price." Ghost growled suddenly, his attention shifting away from the crater toward the lower slopes they descended. Avery followed his gaze, at first seeing nothing but snow and rock. Then movement, dark figures climbing steadily upward, following their trail. At least 4 people in tactical gear, moving with military precision. Not climbers, not rescue. Through her binoculars, she caught details. Weapons strapped to their backs, specialized equipment beyond standard mountaineering gear, communications devices more sophisticated than civilian models. One carried what looked like scientific instruments. All wore unmarked black cold-weather gear, no flags, no identifying insignia. Avery ducked lower, though she was likely already spotted. How had they found her? The GPS transmissions, perhaps, but those had been increasingly erratic, or was it something else? Had she set off some kind of monitoring system when she discovered the wreckage? Or had they been watching this place all along, waiting for someone else to be drawn to the peak? Captain Price's redacted logbook flashed in her memory. Operation, Cold Witness, Classified Priority Ultra. Had the government known about this place for decades? Monitored it? Kept it secret? Ghost's growl deepened, vibrating through his thin frame. For the first time, he bared his teeth, looking more wolf than dog in his protective stance. "We need to move," Avery said, gathering her equipment. Whether she continued up or retreated down, the open crater left her too exposed. She glanced once more at the pulsing light beneath the black ice. Whatever secrets the mountain held, others wanted them controlled, contained. The thought of this place being sectioned off, studied in sterile isolation, perhaps even weaponized, filled her with unexpected dread. "They can't have it," she whispered, surprising herself with the fierce protectiveness in her voice. "They can't have you." The decision crystallized. Onward, upward, to the summit, to the source. Ghost seemed to sense her resolve, moving to the far side of the crater where a narrow path continued the ascent. As Avery rose to follow, the ice behind her groaned, a deep resonant sound more felt than heard. The pulse beneath quickened as if responding to her decision, or perhaps more unsettlingly approving it. The figures below had spotted her. One pointed, and they increased their pace. "Come on, Ghost," she called, turning toward the summit. "We need to find out what's up there before they catch us." The dog led the way, navigating the increasingly otherworldly terrain with confidence. Around them, reality itself seemed to thin. Snow continuing to defy gravity, light bending at impossible angles, shadows falling in directions that contradicted the sun's position. Avery felt strangely calm despite the pursuers below and the impossibilities around her. For the first time since losing her teammates on Annapurna, she was exactly where she needed to be, though whether by choice or by the mountain's design, she could no longer say. Avery crouched behind a jagged outcropping, Ghost pressed against her side. They had climbed another 100 meters before finding this vantage point, high enough to observe the crater while remaining hidden from the approaching team. She adjusted the zoom on her body cam, activating the recording function. Whatever happened next, she wanted evidence. The four figures reached the crater's edge, moving with practiced efficiency. Their leader, a tall man with silver-streaked, dark hair visible when he removed his hood, surveyed the site with clinical detachment. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, though he wore no military insignia. "Perimeter secure, Dr. Rathbone," one of the others reported. "No sign of the climber, but fresh tracks lead upslope." The silver-haired man, Rathbone, nodded. "She can't have gone far. This altitude slows everyone eventually." His voice carried, clearly in the thin air. "Priority is containment. Climber is secondary." He knelt by the black ice, removing specialized equipment from his pack. The team spread out, placing sensors around the crater's circumference. One unfolded what looked like a satellite uplink. "Activation signature is stronger than previous. Greetings," Rathbone announced, studying a handheld device. "The anomaly is responding to her presence, just as we predicted." "Should we initiate Protocol 17? Asked another team member. Rathbone shook his head. "Not yet. First, we seal this exposure point. The Karakoram Protocol is explicit. Containment. Before contact, we can't risk another Price incident." Avery's breath caught. Price incident. They knew about Captain Solomon Price, had always known. Ghost tensed beside her, a nearly silent growl vibrating through his body. Avery placed a steadying hand on his back, feeling the unnatural heat radiating through his thin coat. The dog wasn't just warm, he was hot to the touch, as if running a dangerous fever yet showing no signs of distress. Below, Rathbone removed, his gloves pressing his bare palm against the black ice just as Avery had done. Unlike her, he showed no reaction, no shock, no disorientation. He'd done this before. "The memory transfer is accelerating," he said to his team. "It's trying to communicate more urgently now. Fascinating." The man with the satellite equipment approached. "Sir, we've triangulated her transmissions. The GPS pings we intercepted show erratic patterns, but they confirm she's been receiving feedback." "Of course she has," Rathbone replied. "That's why we're here. The anomaly chose her, just like it chose Price and the others before him. The question is why? What makes her receptive?" Avery activated her satellite phone, not to call out, impossible with their equipment likely monitoring frequencies, but to record audio. The device vibrated strangely in her hand, the screen flickering with symbols she didn't recognize. Not text, not numbers, but something else entirely. Ghost suddenly stiffened, his attention fixed on a point in empty air just beside them. Avery followed his gaze and felt her heart stutter. A figure stood there, translucent, flickering like bad reception, but unmistakably human. A man in a flight jacket, his face gaunt and eyes haunted. Captain Solomon Price, exactly as she'd seen him in the transferred memories, watching her with desperate intensity. Avery blinked hard, but the apparition remained. Ghost could see him too. The dog's eyes tracked the figure's subtle movements. The phantom pilot raised his hand, pointing urgently toward something in the snow near Avery's feet. Moving carefully to remain hidden, she brushed away the snow where he indicated. Her fingers touched leather. Another small notebook, different from the one she'd found in the wreckage. It had been buried here, deliberately hidden. She tucked it quickly into her pocket as Price's ghost flickered and faded. Below, one of the team members called out to Rathbone. "Sir, we're getting energy spikes. The signature just doubled in intensity." Rathbone looked up sharply, scanning the slopes above. "She's nearby. The anomaly is reaching out." His gaze passed over their hiding place, seeming to linger a moment too long. "Prep the neutralizing agent. We're implementing containment protocol." The team produced canisters of some kind, beginning to arrange them around the crater. Whatever they planned, they meant to lock this place away, seal it off, perhaps permanently. Avery retreated further behind the rocks, opening the notebook with trembling fingers. The pages were brittle with age, but preserved by the constant cold. Price's handwriting, more frantic than in his official journal. "They'll come looking. Eventually. If you're reading this, you're like me, it called to you. The mountain isn't a mountain, it's older than Earth itself. A fragment of something vast, conscious. It collects us, our memories, experiences, consciousness, preserves them. I've seen civilizations that existed before humans walked upright. I've heard music from stars that died before our sun was born. The government knows, has known since they found the first site in Antarctica in 1938. They fear it, want to control it. Can't control a mountain? Then bury it, deny it, classify it. But it remembers, always remembers, and sometimes it shares. The summit is the center. The crater is just an echo. If you want truth, climb higher. But be warned, knowledge has weight. Once given, it can't be returned. P.S. The dog isn't a dog. Never was. It's how the mountain walks, how it chooses. Avery looked at Ghost with new understanding. The dog met her gaze steadily, those amber eyes suddenly ancient beyond measure. Not just a stray, not just a companion, something else entirely. As if confirming her realization, the world around her briefly shifted. Reality seemed to separate into layers, like looking through multiple exposures of the same photograph. She saw the mountain as it was now, but also as it had been. Glaciers, advancing and retreating in seconds. Human figures from different eras briefly visible on its slopes. All transparent, all connected by threads of light centering on the summit. In her head, voices whispered in languages she didn't recognize yet somehow understood. Climb. See. Remember for us. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Avery gasping. Below, Rathbone was shouting orders. Energy signature is spiking across the spectrum. Begin neutralization immediately. Finding the climber is now primary objective. She's becoming a conduit. One of the team members poured a steaming liquid onto the black ice. Where it touched, the obsidian surface dulled, the pulsing light beneath dimming. They were killing it, or at least imprisoning it. Something protective and fierce rose in Avery's chest, not just for Ghost, or for the memory of Solomon Price, but for the anomaly itself, for the truth it offered, for the connection it represented. "We need to go," she whispered to Ghost. "Now." The dog, or whatever Ghost truly was, led her away from the vantage point, finding a path invisible to human eyes. They moved higher, always higher, while the team below worked to seal the wound in the mountain. As they climbed, Avery faced her choice with sudden clarity. She could descend now, try to reach civilization with her evidence, expose what was happening here. The world would probably dismiss her findings as fraud or delusion. Rathbone's people would find her, discredit her, silence her. Or she could climb to the summit, find the source, understand what the mountain had been trying to show humanity for generations. The answer came without hesitation. Upward, always upward. The truth, weighted above, not below. Ghost paused, looking back at her with those impossible eyes that had seen millennia pass. The dog's form seemed to waver momentarily, something else partially visible beneath or within the canine shape, something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. "I understand now," Avery told him. "You've been guiding me from the beginning, leading me to this point." The dog made no sound. Ghosts don't bark at the wind, she thought somewhat hysterically, but inclined his head in what could only be acknowledgement before continuing upward. Behind them, Rathbone's voice echoed across the mountainside. "Find her. The protocol is clear, no one reaches the summit, no one." But Avery was already climbing, Ghost at her side, the mountain's ancient consciousness reaching for her with every step. Above 7,000 meters, the air thinned to something barely sustainable. Each breath Avery drew felt insufficient, her lungs straining for oxygen that wasn't there. The final push to the summit loomed before her, a brutal technical climb even without Rathbone's team somewhere below. Ghost moved with impossible energy, unaffected by the altitude that left Avery dizzy and disoriented. The dog, or whatever he truly was, would advance, then wait for her to catch up. Those amber eyes reflecting patience accumulated across eons. "I don't understand how you're not affected," she gasped during one rest. "Even Himalayan wolves don't climb this high." Ghost simply watched her, his form occasionally wavering at the edges, as if struggling to maintain the shape it had chosen. The higher they climbed, the more reality itself seemed to fray. Time stretched like taffy, contracted without warning. Avery checked her watch to find 5 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Then she'd blink and the sun would barely have moved after what seemed like hours of climbing. "What's happening?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she spoke aloud or only in her mind anymore. The answer came not in words but in sensations, impressions of vast scales, of time as a dimension to be traversed rather than endured. The mountain was teaching her, preparing her. Avery paused, squinting against the glare. Something dark marred the pristine snow ahead, footprints cutting a precise line up the incline. She approached cautiously, then stopped, breath catching. In her throat, her own boot prints, distinctive marks from the custom crampons she wore. But she hadn't been here before, hadn't summited yet. "This isn't possible," she said. Ghost circled the tracks, then looked at her meaningfully. The implication sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. These were her footprints from days ahead, already made by a future self, or perhaps from years past, decades before she was born, time looping back, on itself like a Mobius strip. As they continued upward, more impossibilities manifested. Shadows of other climbers flickered across the snowfields, transparent, ephemeral figures ascending and descending with ghostly determination. Some wore modern gear, others the heavy wool and primitive equipment of early alpinists. A few were dressed in clothing from no era Avery recognized. "All of us," she murmured, understanding dawning. "Everyone who's ever climbed this peak or ever will. We're all climbing it simultaneously." The summit itself had changed. No longer merely a geographical destination, it had taken on an almost sentient quality. Watching. Waiting. Avery felt its attention like a physical weight, neither malevolent nor benevolent, simply aware. Ghost suddenly vanished. There one moment, gone the next. Avery called out, her voice swallowed by the immensity around her. For the first time since finding the dog, she was truly alone on the mountain. Panic threatened to overtake her. Without Ghost's guidance, she might wander into one of Rathbone's patrols. Worse, she might miss whatever waited at the summit. The truth she'd sacrificed safety and sanity to find. "Ghost!" she called again, voice cracking from cold and exertion. Movement caught her eye. Ghost, reappearing 50 meters ahead, standing before what appeared to be a narrow fissure in the rock face. As she approached, the crack widened, revealing an entrance to a cavern not visible from below. Ghost slipped inside and Avery followed. The cavern opened into a cathedral of ice, walls of perfect mirrored surfaces reflecting light that had no apparent source. The space should have been dark, yet it glowed with soft blue radiance. Avery's breath created no fog here, though the temperature felt neither warm nor cold, as if the concept of temperature itself had ceased to apply. At the center of the floor, a pattern was etched into the stone beneath the ice, concentric circles intersected by triangles and spirals. Not random, not human-made. A geodesic language written in 3 dimensions extending into the ice itself. "What is this place?" Avery whispered. The whisper echoed, transforming into multiple voices speaking in overlapping languages. The mirrored walls rippled in response, and suddenly Avery was no longer standing in a cavern, but floating in space. Earth a blue-white sphere below. No vertigo, no fear, just wonder as she witnessed her planet from orbit, its weather systems swirling in accelerated time, continents drifting like slow-motion puzzle pieces. The vision shifted. A desert, a flash of light, an atomic mushroom, cloud, but in reverse the destructive energy collapsing inward, healing the scorched earth. Then Captain Solomon Price, strapped in his doomed aircraft, mouth open in a scream she couldn't hear, eyes wide with the same revelation she now experienced. The visions weren't random. They were memories. Human memories collected and preserved by something vast and ancient, something that had crashed to Earth long before humans evolved and embedded itself deep within the mountain. Ghost appeared beside her, his canine form now barely maintaining coherence, light bleeding through the outline of fur and flesh. When he looked at her, his eyes contained galaxies. "We remember everything. All who come, all who touch, all who know." The voice wasn't sound, but thought made tangible, the mountain speaking directly into her mind. "Why me?" Avery asked. "You already hear us? In dreams, in grief, the empty spaces where humans recognize truth." The walls rippled again. This time, Avery saw Rathbone standing before rows of military officials presenting data, diagrams of the anomaly, theories of weaponization, the mountain's consciousness harnessed to see through time, to predict enemy movements, to reach into minds across vast distances. She saw what would follow. The mountain cored like an apple, its substance extracted, its awareness vivisected in sterile labs. The living mind that remembered all of human history reduced to a weapon, a tool, a resource to be exploited. "No," Avery breathed, "I won't let that happen." Ghost, or the entity using Ghost's form, moved closer. Knowledge has weight. Once given, cannot be taken back. And suddenly, Avery understood the choice before her. She could leave with what? She now knew: try to protect the mountain, expose Rathbone's plans. Or she could go deeper, learn the full truth, become something more than witness, become custodian, guardian, perhaps even sacrifice. "Show me," she said, reaching toward the mirrored wall. "Show me everything." Her hand made contact with the ice and consciousness exploded outward. No longer Avery Landon, individual human. Now she was multitude. Every climber who had touched the mountain. Every creature that had lived and died on its slopes. The mountain itself, remembering its journey through cold space, its impact, its patient waiting as simple organisms evolved into beings complex enough to recognize its presence. She experienced Captain Price's final moments of clarity as his plane spiraled down. She felt Maya's distant worry as her sister failed to check in. She witnessed Rathbone's first contact with the anomaly decades ago, his initial wonder calcifying into ambition. Most overwhelming were the mountain's own memories, perspectives, and timescales so vast that Avery's human mind could barely contain them without fracturing. It had been waiting, not with purpose exactly, but with hope for connection, for recognition from the brief, bright sparks of consciousness that flickered across its surface. When Avery's awareness returned to her body, she found herself on her knees, tears frozen on her cheeks. Ghost stood beside her, more light than dog now, a patient presence guiding her back to herself. "I understand now," she whispered. "It's not just a record, it's a communion." The cavern trembled suddenly, ice dust sifting down from above. Outside, voices called to each other, human voices sharp with urgency. Rathbone's team had found them. "Seal all entrances. She's accessed the primary node." Ghost led her toward a passage at the rear of the cavern, a narrow tunnel that wound upward. The true summit waited. Not the geographical peak climbers photographed, but the heart of the anomaly, the center of its consciousness. They emerged onto a small plateau just below the summit proper. The sky above had taken on an impossible color, deeper than twilight but scattered with lights that weren't stars. The air shimmered with potential, with awareness. "Stop right there, Ms. Landon." Rathbone stood 10 meters away, two of his team flanking him with weapons drawn. How they had reached the summit before her, Avery couldn't fathom, until she noticed the helicopter partially hidden behind an outcropping. They had cheated the mountain, bypassed its trials. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Rathbone continued, breath clouding in the thin air. "This entity has existed for millions of years. It's not benevolent, it's not a god. It's a parasite that feeds on consciousness." Ghost growled, the sound resonating at frequencies that made Avery's bones vibrate. "You're wrong," she said. "It doesn't feed, it preserves, it remembers." "It manipulates," Rathbone countered. "It pulled you here just as it pulled Price and dozens before him. People who were susceptible, psychologically primed to receive its signal. People like you, Ms. Landon, carrying just the right kind of trauma to make you receptive." He stepped forward, hand extended. "Help us contain it. Your expertise, combined with what you've experienced, could be invaluable. We don't want to destroy it. We want to understand it. Use it. Control it," Avery corrected. Rathbone's smile was thin. "If necessary. The alternative is to let an alien consciousness influence human minds without restriction. Is that what you want?" Ghost pressed against her leg, warmth pulsing through his increasingly insubstantial form. Above, the summit waited, its presence heavy with expectation. "Last chance, Ms. Landon," Rathbone said. "Help us contain it, or join Captain Price and all the others who vanished into the snow." The wind ceased. In the sudden, perfect stillness atop the world, Avery could hear her own heartbeat, unnaturally loud. Ghost stood beside her, no longer fully substantial. Light pulsed beneath his fur in time with the mountain's own rhythm. Rathbone's team spread out in a semicircle, weapons raised but expressions uncertain. They'd trained for many scenarios, but not for what they were witnessing. A dog transmuting into light, a summit bending reality around itself, a sky that no longer matched any Earth they recognized. "You've seen what it can do," Avery said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You know you can't control this, nobody can." Rathbone's face hardened. "Every force in nature can be harnessed, Miss Landon, even ones we don't fully understand yet." He nodded to one of his men, who removed a cylindrical device from his pack, metallic, with a digital timer display. "We've prepared for this contingency." "Thermite?" Avery guessed, recognizing the containment design from her engineering background. "You think you can burn your way through an entity that survived interstellar travel and millions of years embedded in this mountain?" "Not destroy," Rathbone corrected. "Reset. Break its current connection pattern. The entity itself is too valuable to lose, but its growing awareness is becoming problematic." In Avery's mind, fragments of Price's final journal entry suddenly echoed with crystal clarity. Some things must remain unproven, some forces unnamed. They believe they can control it, but the mountain remembers their hubris just as it will remember mine. Ghost growled, the sound no longer animal but harmonic, vibrating at frequencies that made the snow around them dance and shift. Light poured from his eyes, his outline blurring further. "You've been studying this for decades," Avery said, playing for time as she assessed her options. "Since Price crashed, maybe earlier." Rathbone's smile was thin. 1938, Antarctica. The first fragment was discovered by a German expedition. After the war, we found their research. Operation Cold Witness was the American response. Checking other potential impact sites, Price found this one, though not in the way we'd hoped. His gaze shifted to Ghost. Interesting that it still uses animal forms to interact. The Antarctic fragment preferred birds. This one seems to favor canids. Fascinating mimicry. Not mimicry, Avery corrected. It's trying to communicate in ways we can understand. It remembers everything that's ever lived on this mountain, every consciousness it's touched. Which makes it incredibly dangerous, Rathbone insisted. Imagine a consciousness that can reach across time, influence minds, share memories between individuals separated by decades. The military applications alone. That's all you see? Avery asked, genuine sadness coloring her voice. A weapon? Rathbone signaled his men. Prepare the device, 60-second countdown. The team moved with practiced efficiency. One placed the thermite device at the center of the summit plateau, the heart of the anomaly. Another began arming the detonator. Ghost's form grew increasingly nebulous, light coruscating through what had once appeared as fur and flesh. He turned to Avery, those ancient eyes communicating a final message. Now. Choose now. Without warning, Ghost lunged, not at Rathbone, but at the man with the detonator. Light and substance collided with human flesh, and the guard screamed as memories not his own cascaded through his mind. The detonator flew from his hands, sliding across the icy surface. Neutralize it! Rathbone shouted, drawing his own weapon. Chaos erupted. One guard fired at Ghost, the bullets passing harmlessly through his now ethereal form. Another grabbed for the detonator. Avery dove across the snow, reaching it first. She rolled to her feet, backing toward the edge of the plateau. A shot cracked across the summit. Pain bloomed in Avery's shoulder, searing, immediate. She stumbled but maintained her grip on the detonator. Stop, she gasped. You hit the device, we all die. Rathbone held up his hand, halting his men. Give me the detonator, Ms. Landon, you're injured. Bleeding out at this altitude without immediate medical attention is a death sentence. Ghost reappeared at her, sighed but changed. The bullet meant for Avery had struck him instead. Light spilled from the wound, not blood, pulsing with the mountain's heartbeat. Each pulse made the ground beneath them shudder slightly. Last chance, Rathbone said, advancing, slowly. The entity is destabilizing, that's what happens when it's wounded. It'll collapse this entire peak trying to protect itself. None of us will survive. The summit trembled more violently. Cracks appeared in the ice, glowing with the same light that poured from Ghost's wound. Avery felt the mountain's pain and fear as if it were her own. An ancient consciousness facing extinction or worse, enslavement. In that moment, her path became clear. She backed toward a fissure that had opened behind her, a wound in the summit mirroring the crater below, but deeper, more direct, leading to the anomaly's core. You're right about one thing, she told Rathbone. The mountain remembers. It remembers everything. Every good intention corrupted, every promise broken. It's been watching humanity for millennia, and it's seen this pattern before. Her free hand found her emergency beacon, the one that would transmit her coordinates, and, if she'd said it correctly, the data from her body cam recording everything that had happened. Maya will find this, she said, more to herself than to Rathbone. She'll understand what to do with it. Rathbone's eyes widened as he realized her intention. Don't be a fool. Whatever it's shown you, whatever it's promised, it's manipulation, not revelation. Avery smiled sadly. Maybe. But I'd rather trust something ancient and unknowable than men who see only weapons in every mystery. She activated the emergency beacon, felt it vibrate as it began transmitting. The mountain shuddered again, more violently. Ghost pressed against her leg, his form now more light than substance, urging her toward the fissure behind them. Rathbone lunged forward. Stop her! But it was too late. Avery stepped backward into the fissure, taking the detonator with her, not falling, descending, as if the vertical drop had somehow become a gradual slope. Ghost flowed beside her, around her, his consciousness merging with the mountains and increasingly with her own. In the expanding moment of that descent, memories cascaded through her mind. Not just her own, not just Price's, but countless others. Climbers seeking glory, pilgrims seeking transcendence, animals living and dying across millions of years. The mountain itself, patient and watchful, collecting it all. Above, Rathbone leaped toward the fissure, driven by desperation or scientific obsession or simple human curiosity. But where Avery had been accepted, he was rejected. The mountain convulsed, ice cracking, snow shifting. The thermite device tumbled into the depths, its timer still counting down. As Avery descended deeper into the heart of the anomaly, Ghost's final form dissolved completely, merging with the light that filled the chamber beneath the summit. That light enveloped her, warm and knowing, not hostile, not benevolent, simply aware. "I understand now," she thought, or perhaps spoke aloud. "You don't want to be used. You don't want to be known. You just want to remember." The light pulsed, in response, neither confirming nor denying. In that pulse, she felt the truth. The anomaly didn't think in terms of wants or needs. It simply was. A fragment of something unimaginably vast, fulfilling its function across cosmic timescales, collecting, preserving, remembering. The mountain shuddered again as Rathbone and his men tried to reach the fissure, now closing rapidly. Through Ghost's expanded senses, now partly her own, Avery felt the thermite device continue its countdown. A human solution to a non-human problem. Captain Price's final warning echoed once more. Some things must remain unproven. In the chamber beneath the summit, surrounded by the anomaly's pulsing awareness, Avery made her choice, not to escape, not to destroy, but to protect, to become part of the remembering. She placed her palm against the chamber wall, black ice, like the crater below, but more pure, more direct. The pulse synchronized with her heartbeat. In that synchronization, boundaries dissolved. Avery Landon, individual human, began to merge with something older and vaster than Earth itself. Her last human thought was of Maya. Her sister would receive the transmission, would know something miraculous had happened here, would know Avery had finally found what she'd been seeking since losing her teammates on Annapurna. Not death, but purpose. Not escape, but transcendence. Above, the thermite device reached zero. Light erupted from the mountain's core, not an explosion, but an expansion. Time folded, space bent. The summit collapsed inward, then restructured itself in an eye blink. Snow that had been displaced returned to its original position. Cracks sealed themselves. When stillness returned, the summit stood empty. No Rathbone, no team, no equipment, no thermite device, no fissure, no Avery. Only a single set of boot prints leading to the edge and stopping. Only a mountain, silent and knowing, its secret once again buried beneath snow and ice and time. And somewhere far below, a satellite phone beeped as Maya Landon received an emergency transmission from her sister, sent 7 hours after Avery had been officially declared missing, from a location that satellites showed as empty, uninhabited. Peak. 3 weeks after Avery Landon was declared missing, Maya stepped off a battered jeep into the dusty main street of Ascoli. The Pakistani village sat nestled at the base of the Karakoram Range, the last outpost of civilization before the mountains claimed dominion. Thin air burned her city-accustomed lungs as she shouldered her backpack and surveyed the cluster of stone buildings. "You are the sister," said the driver who had brought her from Skardu, a statement rather than a question. Maya nodded. "How? Did you know?" "Same eyes," he replied simply. "Same way of standing, like the mountain is already calling you." She'd come because the authorities had given up. The official search had been perfunctory at best. A single helicopter sweep that reported no sign of Avery's bright orange tent, no emergency signals, no evidence of her existence on the nameless peak she'd been determined to climb. Maya had come because of the transmission, the impossible data packet that had arrived on her phone 7 hours after the search had been called off. Coordinates, fragments of audio, corrupted video files that technical experts in Islamabad had been unable to fully recover, and a single clear message in her sister's voice. "Maya, I found something. The mountain remembers. Follow the dog." The village headman welcomed her with solemn courtesy, offering tea in his modest home. Other elders gathered, their weathered faces grave as they spoke of what they had witnessed. The summit glowed for 3 nights, one old man told her, his English halting but precise. Like the mountain had swallowed the stars and was giving them back to the sky. Then the storms came, added another. Impossible storms that moved against the wind. The headman leaned forward, his dark eyes intent. Your sister was not the first to be drawn to that peak. Others have gone. Explorers, scientists, pilgrims. Few return. Those who do are changed. Maya sipped her tea, the warmth steadying her. Changed how? The elders exchanged glances. They see things that are not there. Remember events they did not witness. Speak of time bending like a river that flows both ways. And the dog? Maya asked, remembering Avery's cryptic message. My sister mentioned a dog. A murmur passed through the gathered men. The headman nodded slowly. It came to the village 2 days ago. Thin, with one torn ear. Silent, watching. Then it walked back toward the mountain. Some say it is not a dog at all, but the mountain's eyes. Its way of walking among us. Maya spent the night reviewing the fragmented data from Avery's transmission. Most of the video showed only snow and rock, but occasional frames captured something else. A black glassy surface pulsing with internal light. A geodesic pattern etched into stone. A man's face, stern and ambitious, labeled in Avery's notes as Rathbone. In the morning, she hired 2 local guides to take her to the base of the peak, not to climb, but to search for any trace of her sister. The men were reluctant but agreed after she doubled their usual fee. They found nothing at the standard base camp location. No equipment, no signs of previous climbers. The mountain loomed above, serene and indifferent, its summit veiled in clouds. It was the dog that changed everything. They spotted it shortly after noon, sitting motionless on a rocky outcrop, watching their approach. One ear torn, coat patchy, amber eyes reflecting a wisdom no animal should possess. Ghost, Maya whispered, the name coming to her unbidden. The guides refused to go further, making signs against evil. Maya continued alone, following as the dog led her up a narrow, hidden path that seemed to materialize with each step. After an hour of climbing, they reached a small plateau overlooking a glacier field. The dog stopped, pawing insistently at a patch of snow. Maya knelt and began to dig. 20 centimeters down, her fingers touched something solid. A small waterproof case, military grade, decades old but perfectly preserved. Inside, she found a collection of items carefully arranged. Solomon Price's complete journal. A USB drive containing all of Avery's footage and notes. A manila folder stamped Classified Operation Cold Witness, with documents detailing government monitoring of the peak since 1944. A more recent report listing Dr. Elias Rathbone and 3 others as MIA, circumstances unverifiable, and at the bottom a small digital recorder with a single video file. Maya pressed play with trembling fingers. Avery's face filled the small screen. Her sister, hair wild from days on the mountain, eyes alight with wonder and resolve. Behind her, the summit glowed with an inner radiance no natural phenomenon could explain. Maya, Avery's recorded voice began. If you're watching this, I've made my choice. I need you to understand why. Maya sank to her knees in the snow. The dog, Ghost, sitting beside her with uncanny stillness as Avery's final message played. What I've found here goes beyond discovery. It's communion, an entity, a consciousness that crashed to Earth millions of years ago. It doesn't take from us, it preserves us. Every memory, every thought, every soul that touches this mountain becomes part of a vast library of existence. Avery's image flickered, the anomaly's light behind her pulsing stronger. There are people who want to use it as a weapon. Study it in labs, extract its essence. But that would destroy something precious, something meant to witness, not intervene. I've made contact with it, Maya. Through Ghost, who is more than a dog, more than a guide. He's how the mountain walks, how it chooses. The camera panned briefly to show Ghost beside her, light rippling beneath his fur in impossible patterns. I'm not dying, Maya. I'm becoming something else. A guardian, a memory keeper. Part of me will always be your sister, but part of me will be the mountain too. Tears streamed down Maya's face as Avery's final words reached across time and space to find her. Don't let them bury this truth. Don't let them exploit it either. Just let it be known that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed, honored, remembered. The weight of silence I've carried since Annapurna. I understand it now. Some burdens are actually gifts. What looks like isolation can be the deepest connection. The image began to dissolve into light, Avery's features blending with the anomaly's radiance. I love you, Maya. Live fully. And when you look at this mountain, know that I see you too. The screen went dark. Maya sat motionless as sunset painted the peaks in crimson and gold. Ghost remained beside her, his presence both comfort and confirmation. When she finally stood, decision crystallized in her heart. She would not follow Avery. That path wasn't hers to walk, but she would protect what her sister had become part of. Through journalism, through truth, through bearing witness. Even if the world dismissed it as fantasy or the ravings of a grieving sister, the record would exist. The choice would be remembered. I understand, she told Ghost. I'll make sure others do too. The dog's amber eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he rose, turning toward the higher slopes. Maya watched as he padded away, his form gradually becoming translucent against the snow, light bleeding through what had seemed solid just moments before. At the ridgeline, Ghost paused, looking back one final time. In that instant, Maya thought, she saw Avery's face superimposed over the dog's, her sister's smile fleeting but unmistakable. Then Ghost vanished, dissolving into the mountain air. That night, as Maya made her way carefully back to the village, the summit glowed briefly, a pulse of acknowledgement visible for kilometers around. The locals gathered outside their homes, murmuring prayers and old stories. The mountain knows. The headman told her when she returned. It always knows. 3 months later, Maya published her account. The summit knows, a mountain's memory, to worldwide controversy. Scientific journals dismissed it as delusion. Religious leaders claimed divine significance. Conspiracy theorists embraced it as proof of alien contact. Government agencies denied any knowledge of Operation Cold Witness or Dr. Elias Rathbone. But climbers, those who knew mountains as living entities with their own wisdom, they understood. They left the nameless peak alone, honoring its mystery with their absence. And occasionally trekkers in the region would report seeing a dog with amber eyes and one torn ear, watching from distant ridgelines before vanishing into the snow. Guides would nod knowingly but say nothing, understanding that some truths live only in silence. The mountain remembered. The mountain watched. And somewhere within its ancient consciousness, Avery Landon still climbed, forever ascending toward a summit both reached and unreachable, her human journey transformed into something timeless and profound. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.